going to tell us about two of everything.
This is a Chinese folk tale. Now, Mr. and Mrs. Cat were very old and very poor, and they lived on the side of a mountain, and they only had a small green patch of land in which they grew vegetables. That was all they had, and they had to use up all they had, and there was very little left over to buy anything else. They certainly couldn't buy anything fancy and important like chocolate. So one day, Mr. Tack was out in the garden, and he was digging in the garden, and all of a sudden he heard clunk, clunk, and he began digging some more, and finally he unearthed a big brass pot, and he lifted it up and staggered to the house, looking very proud, and opened the door, and there stood Mrs. Hack-Tack. He put the pot on the ground, and she looked at it. She said, "What's this?" He said, it's a pot, and it's probably very useful because my belt purse fell into it." She said, "Well, a very small pot would hold all the money that we have. And besides, for a bath, it's too small, and for a pot on the stove, it's too large." Still, she was very curious, so she looked into the pot, and her hairpin fell blink into the pot, and her hair fell down on her shoulders. So she reached in to grab her hairpin, and as she did, she shrieked. And he came running to her, and he said, "What is it, a snake?" She said, "I have 2 hairpins, and you have 2 purses." Well, they discussed this among themselves, and they said, "Well, certainly the imposter purse would not have the same amount of money as the first one," but when they opened it up, they counted the coins in the first one, and they opened the second one up, and it had the same amount of coins. So they started thinking, well, there's something unusual about this pot. So Mr. Hack-Tack said, "Get your bag of lentils that I brought in from the garden, and let's put that in the pot." So Mrs. Hack-Tack grabbed the bag of lentils, and they put it in the pot, pulled it out, and then they found another bag of lentils. So Mr. Hack-Tack thought ahead and thought, it's going to be very, very cold, so we should have another blanket. So Mrs. Hack-Tack went over to the linen closet, she grabbed a blanket, and they stuffed it into the pot. They pulled out the first blanket, and there was yet another blanket. Then Mr. Hack-Tack thought, it's going to be very cold, and so you should have as heavy a coat as I do. So she went over to the coat rack, grabbed his coat, they stuffed it into the pot, and brought out one coat and yet another coat for Mrs. Hack-Tack to wear. But then Mrs. Hack-Tack thought, well, it's too bad that we don't have any chocolate. So Mr. Hack-Tack said, well, let's take the purses, and we'll put money in of the purses, and each time we'll have twice as much, and we can go to market and get whatever we want. So they started putting in the purses, taking out one, and always a second one, adding new money to the old, each time until, after a while, they had a whole hill of purses. This seemed a bit much. So Mrs. Hacktack said, let's just put in the money. So they put in the money, and each time they drew out twice as much, until they had so much they could put it in the blanket, the extra blanket. They got a little tired, and it was time for bed. So when they went to bed, they didn't go to sleep right away. They sat and talked about all the things they do for the cottage and all the things that they would buy at the market. And finally, they fell asleep. Mr. Hacktack woke up in the morning very excited, and so he went to get all the money that he needed for market, and he gathered it all up, and he went out the door, down the stairs, bam, 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 and Mrs. Hacktack woke up with all that noise and decided that she too would get up because she was excited too. So she started tidying up and dusting in the corners and putting in one hairpin and getting two, taking her one candle into the pot and getting two. She was pretty happy about this, so she decided to make rice on the stove. So she poured the water and poured the rice in and a little bit of salt, turned it off. By this time, she was pretty tired. So she decided to take a nap. And when she did for a while, she woke up before Mr. Hacktack came in. And she thought, well, I've got to test that pot one more time. So she went out to the garden and she grabbed a cabbage leaf and she stuck the cabbage leaf into the pot. Then she pulled out two cabbage leaves. And she got on the floor and she put her arms around the pot and she said, "You are the best friend we have ever had." At this point, Mr. Hacktack came in and she looked and she saw that he had a pile of things that he had bought, including a box of chocolates. And she was so excited at seeing this, she lost her balance and she fell right into the pot. Now, Mr. Hacktack was shocked and he put down his belongings because he could see the kicking legs of Mrs. Hacktack coming from the pot. So he ran to pull her ankles out and put her on the floor. But when he did, there was another pair of kicking legs coming from the pot. And he ran again to pull her out and put her on the floor. A second Mrs. Hacktack, not knowing really where she was, who she was, or what was going to happen next. The second Mrs. Hacktack, the first Mrs. Hacktack said when she looked at the second, "I will not have another Mrs. Hacktack in the house." And she carried on and she cried and she wrung her hands and carried on. And Mr. Hacktack just said, "Well, what did you want me to do? Leave her there?" She said, "Put her back." He said, "Oh, sure. Draw two of her and have three of you. One of you is all I can handle." Mrs. Hacktack was really still upset, and so was Mr. Hacktack. But he was so upset that he too fell into the pot. And when he did, there were the kicking legs of Mr. Hacktack coming from the pot, and the two Mrs. Hacktacks looked at each other, and they ran and they pulled him out of the pot and set him on the floor. But then there was another pair of kicking legs coming from the pot. So they ran again, and they pulled a second Mr. Hacktack, who again looked just as bewildered as the other one. So this time, the first Mr. Hacktack said, "I will not have a second I am in charge here, and he stormed and he raged. But finally, Mrs. Hacktack was sharing some of the chocolates with the other Mrs. Hacktack, and she said, "Oh, don't scold. You see, they, who are ourselves, and yet not ourselves, they could live next door." And they thought, this is a good idea. So they built another house right next door, and the two other Hacktacks lived there. And as the neighbors passed by, they talked a lot about the Hacktacks. And they said, you know, when Mr. and Mrs. Hacktack became rich, they decided to have two of everything, even themselves. And that's the story of Two of Everything.